The following program is presented by the Theosophical Society in America.
In our 3 previous programs, we took a detailed look at how the universe comes into being from the theosophical perspective, how life moves from the one to the many, issuing forth, in a sense, from the most subtle spirit to the densest matter. In this program, we want to look at what happens next. How do the forms of life proceed? Theosophical philosophy suggests that all of life, including human beings, evolves in a gradual but progressive fashion back to the spiritual. Regarding this process, the 3rd fundamental proposition of the secret doctrine asserts the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul, the latter being itself an aspect of the unknown root, and the obligatory pilgrimage for every soul, a spark of the former, through the cycle of incarnation, or necessity, in accordance with cyclic and karmic law during the whole term. In other words, no purely spiritual buddhi, divine soul, can have an independent, conscious existence before the spark which issued from the pure essence of the universal 6th principle, or the oversoul, has A, passed through every elemental form of the phenomenal world of that manvantara, and B, acquired individuality, first by natural impulse, and then by self-induced and self-devised efforts, checked by its karma, thus ascending through all the degrees of intelligence, from the lowest to the highest manas, from mineral and plant up to the holiest archangel, Jnani Buddha.
You can see, I think, that from that fundamental proposition, we're really entering the area of evolution, because she talks about the gradual unfoldment, the experience of the individual going through all the different kingdoms, progressing up to the level of the human being and beyond. If we look at evolution in a general sense first, we can then maybe get some idea of where the early Darwinian theories differ with the theosophical theories. No matter who's looking at evolution, we see that there are long stages of development, aren't there? If we're looking at the geological ages of the Earth, even down in the Grand Canyon, we can see long stages of development. Each stage has identifiable features and characteristics, so we can distinguish it from a past age or a future age. With each level of development, at least in living creatures, we find more freedom. We find more complex forms. We find greater ability. More is going on. Now, to here, science and theosophy, even Darwinian, to some extent agree. It isn't really in any major conflict if you just look at it in that way. But the theosophical point of view here is quite different from the early Darwinian view, but not so different from the more modern evolutionary theories. I understand that modern evolutionary theory is coming closer and closer to a theosophical point of view. And the theosophical point of view is essentially this, that evolution proceeds from within outward. That is, it goes from the inner potential and the reality of things to an expression in the exterior world of that inner potential, so that it becomes revealed or manifest or functional or actual, existent, and not just potential.
The Jesuit priest and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin also sensed that the outer forms of life had a kind of inner reality that determined their particular makeup.
And he said, for example, that the saber-toothed tiger has the tooth of a saber-toothed tiger because it has the soul of a saber-toothed tiger. And that's a very theosophical idea, that evolution works from within, without, and that the exterior reveals the inner potential, expresses the inner potential. For example, a mature tree grows from a seed, doesn't it? So we can have an acorn, and a little child might say, "Gee, Mommy and Daddy, is there a little tree inside the acorn, and does the tree just get bigger and bigger?" Well, we say no, that isn't true. What happens is the potential for that tree is there all the time. I know the chemical constituents may be described thoroughly by the botanists and so forth, but they can't tell you why that turns into a tree. It just does. And they don't really have an explanation for the life force that makes it a tree, do they? So it's as though that the nature of it inwardly forces it finally to become what it is, you see? It reveals its nature over a period of time, which is evolutionary in one sense. Now, from a theosophical view, the whole evolutionary process in its basic nature, the whole of that is potentially present from the beginning. It's an orderly universe we live in. As someone once said, to say that there is no order in the universe is tantamount to saying that the unabridged dictionary is the result of an explosion in the printing factory. We do live in an orderly universe. We are, all of us, conceived, when we're talking about the physical life, grow from the tiny cells into a fetus, and we're born. We don't start out at age 40 and work in the opposite direction, do we? It's inevitable that that's the growth process. It must be. It can't work any other way. There's all kinds of mutations, human mutations, people born with 6 fingers instead of 5 or with 1 instead of 5. Those things all happen, but they're human mutations, aren't they? A human woman does not give birth to an elephant. It just doesn't happen. We live in an orderly universe. So that basic process, you see, from a theosophical point of view, lies in that potential from the beginning. It's set, in one sense, as a process. But every little thing in it is not set. So we mustn't think of it as predestination.
An interesting example of this notion that there is an inner reality guiding the activity of life comes from a most unsuspecting place. In the early 1950s, a botanist, Professor William Seifritz from the University of Pennsylvania, was doing an experiment with slime mold, a primitive form of protoplasm. This simple life form did only one thing apparent to the human eye. It flowed in a cyclic fashion back and forth, first in one direction and then the other, varying neither in the time it took nor the distance or direction it traveled. Professor Seifritz decided to anesthetize the protoplasm to see what would happen. He assumed that it would stop moving for a time, and that once the anesthesia wore off, the protoplasm would begin moving again from where it had stopped.
It didn't do it. What happened was, to his complete surprise, was that the protoplasm picked up where it would have been had it never been interrupted. That suggests the likelihood that the life force itself is in the nature of a field, an inner reality. You see, fields are non-material in character, aren't they? Nobody's ever going to touch gravity, only the consequences of gravity, only gravity revealed in substance, not gravity itself. The field is non-material, but it's a dynamic field, you see. And if you can take again that iron filing and magnet example, if you can imagine that the protoplasm was like the iron filings on the paper, and you took a magnet and went back and forth with it, you can see that the iron filings would be moving back and forth according to the movement of the magnet, couldn't you? Now, if you can imagine that the nature of life, the life field, if we can put it that way, is dynamic, it is moving, and the protoplasm is responding to it, you see? So that if the protoplasm is forced to stop, as if we could hold on to all those iron filings and say, now you're not going to move anymore, you see, because I got you. The field would still be moving, but the protoplasm would be prevented from responding to it, you see. So it's said that the inner creates the conditions actually for the outer. Now let's come to manas, because you see each of our human principles are localizations in a sense of universal principles. Manas is also universal, the organizing principle, the principle of order in the universe in a sense. And if you look at the possibility that as protoplasm is organized into cells and into organs and into creatures, and you see that as the work of manas, the principle of manas, you see by its very presence, it gradually molds that substance into its own expression. And that's the revelation from a theosophical perspective of manas in the physical world, the ordering of the substance itself. So each level, in a way, brings about the conditions, the inner levels bring about the conditions for the next level below it. So now we come to human evolution. We're going to just treat it in this particular session as human beings in general, the race of humanity. And in the next session, we'll deal more with the individual evolution, which is the spiritual life or self-transformation. It's said in the theosophical philosophy that human beings also go through very definite stages, just as we do physically, infancy, childhood, youth, adult, old age. There are stages in human development as well, and they have characteristics as well. When we speak of the races in theosophy, we do not speak of what is known as ethnic differences in ordinary speech. What we're talking about in theosophy when we refer to the races is humanity as a whole, and the races to a theosophist mean broad stages of development.
According to the secret doctrine, there are 7 such races called root races, which humanity passes through during its evolutionary trek. Each of these stages encompass an enormous period of time. In fact, the first 2 root races are so old that they precede by millions of years any scientific estimates for the beginnings of humankind. According to theosophy, humanity is said to exist during these first 2 stages in ethereal form only, without physical bodies of any kind.
In the 3rd stage, humans become actually physical, and that, says Blavatsky, probably relates to the myths of ancient Lemuria. So far back in historical time that artifacts almost don't remain. I think she says that some of the artifacts on Easter Island, those incredible huge statues, were remnants of the Lemurian age. Whether that's true or not, I wouldn't argue. But she suggests that humans came into existence physically around that time. And in the middle of the 4th root race, which she suggests was what the myths call ancient Atlantis, human beings were now rooted in the physical world, and the personal ego had finally developed. In the earlier ages, there wasn't that strong sense of me that developed around the Atlantean time. It was more a group consciousness than it was a me individual consciousness, according to the doctrine. But in the Atlantean age, the me came strong, and we as a human race, you and I, remember, we're not talking about people in the past, we're talking about us in the past. You and I learned how to get what we wanted by using our mind. Now, the human ego has gotten a very bad press, and it deserves it in one sense, and in another it doesn't. Personally, I can't see anything bad or wrong or undesirable in something that is so universal. Birth, death, everything in between. I think it's just when it gets distorted in our minds and we misunderstand that it becomes unsavory. The human ego must surely have had a purpose in coming into being. I don't pretend to say I know precisely what it is, because I don't. But anything so universal, seems to me, must have a purpose. Perhaps, and I'm taking a wild guess, slightly educated guess, perhaps it was because consciousness needed to be focused, needed to be centralized, needed to get experience in a very finite way before it could have deeper understanding of its own nature. That may be the case. I like to liken the human ego to a chicken egg's shell. When a chicken lays an egg, that shell, which separates it from the rest of the world, doesn't it? Like our ego separates us from the rest of the world. My sense of me separates me from not me. That shell is terribly important, isn't it? If the chicken doesn't lay an egg with a nice firm shell, I always say you get premature scrambled eggs. There's no chick. It doesn't grow. The shell protects the development of what's going on inside, doesn't it? It's a little bit like that, I think, with the human ego. Bit by bit, the chick grows within that egg, separated from the rest of the world, isolated all on its own, having nothing but its own internal experiences and not relating to the exterior world. But there comes a point, doesn't there, in the development of that chick within the egg shell, where the chick must break the shell. And the chick must break it from within. So it is with you and me. There comes a point, and we call this now the spiritual life. When the spiritual life begins, you and I must begin to chip away at that shell, break it down, so that we're able to live. He who will keep his life will lose it, and he who will lose his life will find it. So in a sense, we're breaking up that sense of the personal self as a personal ego, not the sense of individuality, so that we can be born into a greater reality. If the chick didn't have the shell in the beginning, it would be dead, and if it didn't break the shell at the appropriate moment, it would also die. So I think the human ego is a little bit like that.
The fifth root race is the next stage of evolutionary development, and is the one present-day humanity is said to be about midway through. Unlike the Atlantean period, where the focus was on the development of a strong personal ego and the emotional nature, the fifth root race is said to focus on the development of the mind.
Eons from now, from our point of view, ages from now, certainly quite a long number of years, Blavatsky says the beginnings of the next race will come. It doesn't happen at the stroke of midnight on a certain day. Bit by bit, so that they overlap enormously, human beings come in who are already through the developmental stage that most of us are going through, and they're starting to develop the next stage. You know, in any schoolroom, all children aren't equal in their state of development. They're equal in their spirits and their souls and in their human worth, but their development isn't the same, is it? So one child is precocious and zooms above the others, and there's a sort of a bulk in the middle, and then there's the laggards. And so it is with the human race. So bit by bit, the precocious ones start coming in until finally the precocious ones are the majority, and that's the new root race. In the next race, the so-called sixth, the intuition is to be developed. You see, it's going along in a way with these principles. You see, the physical body, the emotional nature is developed, the mind is developed. Now we're working the other way, in a sense. And now we have the development in the sixth root race, which comes in at some very, very long time from now, the development of intuition in the theosophical sense that we spoke about in the last session. Not psychic hunch. That's been around for a long time. And even animals have a kind of psychic sense sometimes, don't they? But intuition in the theosophical sense, the ability to turn one's mind to any problem, to any idea, to any situation at any level, and by just focusing the mind on it clearly to get the insight and to understand. In the Mahatma letters, K.H. says at one point, there comes a time when it's all worth it. That is, all the human suffering and difficulty and hard work. It's all worth it because we have access to every first truth. To me, that means the full development of this principle we call buddhi. That is, the adept is able to turn attention to that level of reality and get the insight right away, rather than to just hope he gets a flash of insight from time to time as we get a flash of insight from time to time. Buddhi is alive and well in all of us, but it's a trickle, isn't it? We don't get the Big Bang enlightenment until we have grown enormously with many, many insights. Now, from a theosophical perspective, physical evolution has come to an end. That is, in this system, we can't speak for other galaxies. We can only speak about our own world, our own system. Physical evolution has come to an end. There are no new, more magnificent species or more horrible species than the human race coming into existence. Oh, there may be changes, there may be what appear to be new species from time to time, that kind of thing. But human beings from the third root race on have been pretty much the same physically. Not totally, maybe, but pretty much the same. They've had 2 eyes and 2 ears and a nose and a mouth and all of that. That's been the way it is, and it's the way it's going to be according to the secret doctrine. We're going to be pretty much like we are. But there is an inner evolution now that's necessary. And the theosophical philosophy says that up to the stage of the human being, it happens naturally, it happens passively. Nobody had to consciously, at least the creatures and us, do anything about it. We didn't consciously build our own body. It happened. So you don't have this conscious idea until we become human. Now, it is said, we must take charge, or evolution stops. Very interesting idea. And look at the human race. How different are we from the Middle Ages? Oh, technologically, very. But do you think our problems are very different? Do you think that we have worries different from our ancestors? Don't we worry about life and death, illness, family, friends, how we get along with others? Don't you think that was true? War, all those things. They're really still around unless we change ourselves, according to this doctrine. Now, I mentioned modern evolutionary theory. There is a very interesting theory that sounds rather theosophical these days, the idea that evolution is proceeding by conflict to resolution. That is, the difficulties that come before us have to be resolved. They force us to do something about them. Let's take an example in modern history. After the First World War, the world view of the Western world especially was rather shattered, wasn't it? That such a horrendous conflict could be. It shook people's complacency and their belief in some of their traditions. It began to shake the foundations of their worldview. And so what was done? There was an effort to sort of prevent something like that from happening again. People began, for the first time in a big way, to think globally, didn't they? They formed the League of Nations. Well, it didn't work too well. But nature itself experiments. Nature produced the dinosaurs. They didn't work too well, so she gave them up. But then the Second World War came with the most monstrous thing, the Holocaust, and all of that, and the world was really shaken then. So after the Second World War, with that terrible shock, the effort was to again do something so that these horrible things would never occur again. And the United Nations was formed. It doesn't work perfectly, but it works much better. And we have nations now working in concert. Whether we agree with what they do or whether we don't agree, they're working more together. There's more a sense of global consciousness than there ever was before. This is a stage, in a sense, of the evolutionary process, that humanity is beginning to understand its interrelatedness and the need to work together. It's very interesting, really, that the word Buddha comes from the Sanskrit Buddh, which means awake. So the Buddha is the awakened one. And how do we wake up? Don't we wake up by a kind of shock? We have an alarm clock that sometimes makes us leap clear of the bed. Or even a nice softer one, the radio. Something goes off, and the shock of it wakes us up. That's true inwardly as well, it seems to me. H.P. Blavatsky in The Key to Theosophy suggests that human beings learn, and she puts it rather strongly, only by pain. Now, I would qualify it a little bit and maybe say only by challenge, but it is usually painful, isn't it? We learn more from the things that hurt us in life than we learn from the fun we have. I venture to say. Everyone can look back in their experience and see that that's likely true. So it's because we are shocked into doing something that we begin to dig deeper in ourselves. If we went along placidly and happily and everything was happy, 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 we'd never bother looking at anything. Death, very often in a family, is the first time that many members of the family seriously consider what life is about. For the first time in many people, when they lose somebody they love, they say, why? And that's a spiritual question. Why? And in the next session, we're going to deal with this inner transformation of the individual, the evolutionary process that goes on after the passive one, which we've just talked about, the gradual development through a passive means up to the level of the human, the development from the human on by self-conscious effort. And in the final session, which is next, we will talk about what it is in principle that we need to do.